a ghost species of ancient human. It was too large, however, to be from a modern man or Neanderthal. Siberia's ancient ghost clan starts to surrender its secrets. The first human group ever identified solely through DNA. You'd better sit down. In the southern part of remote Siberia, there is a cave. It lies hidden in a small birch grove, not far from the Anhui River. A very convenient place to live if you happen to be, say, a hermit. According to local legend, an old hermit named Dionysius lived here in the 18th century, and the cave supposedly took its name from him. Denisova Cave. But that is not the story that drew scientists here some 50 years ago. About 15 kilometers from Denisova Cave lies Karama, an early Paleolithic site. So even in the Soviet period, archaeologists had good reason to suspect that this cave might preserve traces of prehistoric humans. Denisova Cave is a horizontal cave with a wide entrance and easy access to water. For many thousands of years, it served as a reliable shelter for both humans and animals. You do not need climbing gear to get inside. The cave covers about 270 square meters and stretches roughly 110 meters in length. Its widest and tallest chamber lies deeper inside. And, importantly, that chamber has a through hole a little over a meter across. That opening lets in natural light and creates excellent ventilation for smoke. The grotto stays dry year-round, even though the air temperature is close to the temperature outside. It was, in every practical sense, an excellent natural refuge from wind and rain. Over the years, excavations in the cave uncovered the remains of wild animals and livestock, ancient ornaments such as bracelets and pendants, even a bone needle with a drilled eye for sewing. And of course, plenty of evidence pointing to the presence of prehistoric humans and Neanderthals. But the discovery that would truly revolutionize science came in 2008. In the east chamber of Denisova Cave, archaeologists found the tip of a pinky finger belonging to a 9-year-old girl. At the time, it was just one tiny bone among stones and dust. The archaeologists were carefully working through the layers, while right beside them lay something that would eventually change the story of human evolution. It is not surprising that no one paid special attention to it at first. Only 2 years later, at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, did researchers analyze its mitochondrial DNA. Put simply, mitochondrial DNA is not the whole genetic library. It is more like a thin thread of inheritance, passed down through the maternal line. It is especially useful for first-pass testing, when there is very little material to work with. The scientists expected the fragment to turn out to be either from a modern human or, at most, a Neanderthal. But the result was different. Svante Pääbo and Johannes Kraus, who carried out the analysis, later recalled that their phone conversation that day began with the words, "You'd better sit down." That is how shocking the result was. Years later, in 2022, Svante Pääbo would receive the Nobel Prize, in part for work connected to discoveries like this one. The analysis showed that the bone belonged neither to a Neanderthal nor to a modern human. It came from a previously unknown group of ancient humans. Their common ancestor with Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had lived around 1 million years ago. Suddenly, it became clear that in southern Siberia, at roughly the same time, several different human lineages may have coexisted. Later, when researchers were able to study nuclear DNA, not just that small maternal thread, but the main archive of inherited information, the picture became even more interesting. This unknown group turned out to be closely related to Neanderthals, essentially a sister lineage. Later, they would be named Denisovans, after the cave. And most importantly, these were not just some vanished humans from the distant past. Their traces survive in the genomes of people living today, especially among populations in Oceania and Melanesia. And that is what really changed the story. This was not just some forgotten evolutionary side branch. It was an ancient human lineage that, in a very real sense, still lives on in people today. Among Europeans, the Denisovan contribution is extremely small, around 0.02%. But among some populations in Oceania, especially Melanesians, it can reach roughly 4 to 6%. Interestingly, Denisovan remains had actually been found in the cave even earlier, during the Soviet era, in the form of a molar tooth. At the time, though, no one could tell who it belonged to. Only later, with the rise of paleogenetics, was the tooth analyzed and shown to be hugely important. And rather absurdly, between its discovery and its analysis, that valuable specimen was reportedly kept in nothing more glamorous than a matchbox in someone's desk. Now, let us step back from the details for a moment and ask a bigger question. How closely related were these three lineages, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans? Their common ancestor lived around 700,000 years ago. The lineage leading to modern humans split off around 600,000 years ago. Neanderthals and Denisovans then split from each other around 400,000 years ago. In other words, those two were more closely related to each other than either was to us. These and many other facts were established through repeated genetic analyses of material from Denisova Cave. Scientists were even able to extract DNA from a tiny sliver of bone known as Denisova 11 and determine that it belonged to a first-generation child of a Neanderthal and a Denisovan. Most likely, the father was Denisovan and the mother was Neanderthal. Even more impressively, researchers were able to recover Denisovan DNA directly from the cave sediment itself. Microscopic traces remain in the soil, fragments of bone, feces, and other organic material. Molecules can cling to mineral surfaces, especially clays, and survive for astonishing lengths of time. The cave turned out to be more than just a place where ancient humans once lived. It was a long archive, where the past settled layer by layer. All of this was possible because of the cave's unique microclimate. In fact, archaeologists even built a special cable system to help collect sediment samples there. The earliest Denisovan DNA came from a layer that began accumulating around 250,000 years ago. By human standards, that is an enormous span of time. Another crucial clue came from Tibet. Among Tibetan populations, researchers found a Denisovan genetic legacy in the form of the EPAS1 gene, which is associated with adaptation to high altitude and low oxygen levels. In other words, an ancient encounter between two human lineages left behind not just some exotic mark in the genome, but a genuinely useful biological tool for surviving in high mountains. The next major turn came far from the Altai, in Baishiya Cave on the Tibetan plateau. According to the accepted reconstruction, a local Buddhist monk found an ancient lower jaw there back in 1980, and it later entered the collection of Lanzhou University. But its real scientific significance became clear only decades later. Researchers extracted ancient proteins from one of its molars and showed that the owner of the jaw had been a Denisovan. Dating placed it at no less than 160,000 years old. And that mattered because it meant two things at once. Denisovans lived far beyond the Altai, and they were capable of surviving at high altitude long before Homo sapiens appeared there. The farther the story went, the more complicated the picture became. Modern genetic surveys suggest that admixture did not happen just once, and not with a single isolated population. In other words, Denisovans were clearly not some tiny group trapped in one cave. They were a whole network of related populations spread across East Asia and adapted to very different environments. Later, Baishiya Cave itself reinforced that picture. Denisovan mitochondrial DNA was recovered from its sediments in layers dating to around 100,000, 60,000, and possibly even 45,000 years ago. So Baishiya became another point on the growing Denisovan map of Asia, a map that keeps turning out to be wider than anyone expected. And this is one of the great advantages of finds made directly in ancient habitats. You can study not just bones, but prey remains, sediments, traces on cave walls, and much more. In a way, archaeologists are literally collecting Earth, and that Earth can still hold a remarkable amount of information. which means caves like these may continue to produce new discoveries well into the future. But perhaps the most dramatic late chapter in this story is connected to a skull from the Harbin region. According to the family story, an almost complete skull was found as far back as 1933 during bridge construction, and then hidden away for decades, though parts of that story are now disputed. It only truly entered science in the 21st century. At first, the skull was loudly discussed as a possible new species, Homo longi, or Dragon Man. Some researchers in China argued that it represented a new kind of human. But even then, doubts had already started to appear, especially when scientists compared the Harbin skull with the Baishiya jaw. Denisovans were known for their unusually large teeth, and even at first glance, the two fossils seemed to share that feature. Then, Chalmei Fu entered the story, one of the researchers who had also been involved in the analysis of the first Denisovan finger bone. Scientists first looked for DNA in the teeth, and in the dense petrous bone at the base of the skull, usually one of the best places for ancient DNA to survive. But they found nothing. For many people, that could have been the end of the story. Instead, researchers turned to protein analysis. They identified 95 endogenous proteins from the skull itself, including variants characteristic of Denisovans. Then, almost unexpectedly, they tried extracting mitochondrial DNA from dental calculus. In other words, hardened tartar. At first glance, that sounds almost ridiculous. One of the most important genetic clues to an ancient human was found not in the bone itself, but in mineralized deposits on the teeth. But that is exactly where enough material had survived. And honestly, that is one of the most beautiful things about modern science. Sometimes, the answer comes from the last place you would think to look. And in a way, it felt almost symbolic. The skull had stayed silent for decades, but eventually, its story began to speak. In June 2025, Chalmei Fu and her colleagues announced that the skull's mitochondrial DNA and endogenous proteins clustered with those of early Denisovans from southern Siberia. And she said something that captures the weight of the moment perfectly. After 15 years, we finally gave the Denisovan a face. So in 2025, science moved closer to what had been missing from the beginning. The first truly convincing skull linked to Denisovans, and the first more complete picture of what they may have looked like. But even here, there was no full silence of agreement. Some researchers found the evidence persuasive, others still considered it debatable. And in a way, that may be even more important than the headline itself. Science is a living argument, not a choir singing in perfect unison. The ending of this story works better not as, now everything is clear, but as, now we can see just how much is still unclear. We already know that Denisovans were spread widely across Asia. We know that their DNA survives in modern people. We know that Tibetan adaptation to high altitude is linked to a Denisovan-derived version of EPAS-1. And early genetic estimates connected Denisovan ancestry in Melanesians to roughly 4 to 6% of their genomes. But the debates are far from over. How many Denisovan populations there were, how exactly they should be classified, whether some bones in museum collections have been misidentified, and why Denisovans disappeared in the first place. Denisovans are no longer a faceless ghost, but they are not a fully solved chapter either. They have become closer to us. And somehow, that has only made the mystery